Okay, this one is called the Sermon on Arios-Pagos, and that might not spring to mind, but it's actually a phrase or a word in the Bible. It's a Greek word, and we'll explain what it means in just a moment. We all know the Sermon on the Mount, and that was the sermon that Jesus gave, a long sermon, like 4 or 5 chapters long. But for Paul, we don't actually have the text of any of his sermons. And so we do have this text of the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gave, and someone wrote that down and recorded that. So we were able to actually see Jesus in action, Jesus preaching to people. Well, with Paul, most of Paul's writings are well, they're writings, of course. There are things that he has written to other churches. And so we don't really normally get accounts of him preaching. We just see a few words sometimes, and nothing like that. And so there is this one place where there's a real sermon by Paul. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. And so this this sermon by Paul was also on a mountain or a hill. I've seen real mountains, and these mountains are what I would call a hill. And so the Sermon on the Mount was what I would call a hill, and this sermon was also on a hill. It's a solid rock hill that's in Greece. We'll talk about more about that later on. And so that's kind of what these two sermons have, is that they're both given on a mountain. So we're going to look at a number of different things in this sermon. I'm sure you've read this. This was when Paul was in Athens. And so we're going to look at the location where he is and the reason why he's given this sermon. And so what has kind of inspired this and caused him to be giving this sermon to people. We're also going to look at his audience, the people who are listening to him. And that's always important when we're talking to people, is to speak in terms that the audience can understand. And we try to do that, although that can be a real challenge sometimes. And also we're going to look at the culture, because that has a very big effect here. Their religious culture, their political culture, those things are important for the listeners too. So it's not just who the audience are, but the culture that the audience lives in, and the way they think about things. And so we're also going to look at the approach taken by Paul, and this is perhaps the most important thing, is what approach has he used to give this sermon and of course it's the Spirit. We're not talking about Paul doing this independently. This is the Spirit working through Paul to give this sermon. So the Spirit has given Paul these words to give to them, and we're going to look at these words and ask, why are these appropriate words? Why why does this make a good sermon for his audience? Okay, so it begins in Acts 17. And Acts 17 would be probably the only place where you'd see any of Paul's actual speaking to people like that quoted, because everything else is an epistle from Paul that he's written to somebody else, some other church. So from Acts 17, 16 through 17, and we're going to be going through a set of verses here bit by bit. But while Paulus remained in Athens, he was provoked in his spirit when he saw that the whole city was full of idols. So he's wandering around in Athens. He's been there for a few days. And everywhere he goes, he sees idols. And I get that. I was in Italy, and yeah, you can still see an awful lot of idols there. And so he was going around in the whole city. And what's he doing when he goes around? And he was speaking in a synagogue with the Jews and with those who were worshipers of God. And he was speaking in the marketplace with those who gathered every day. So what he's doing in his spare time is he's going around spreading the gospel message. And so the gospel message traveled, just as the Bible says, through the synagogues. It was first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. And so he goes to a synagogue and speaks to the Jews there. And he's not just speaking about Judaism, he's going to be talking about Jesus and who Jesus is. And that's his mission. And so he goes to a synagogue and he meets with Jews and other people who are not genetic Jews, but are also worshipers of God. So they are probably Greeks who have become Jews. And so he preaches and talks in the synagogues, and he also goes to the marketplace. Now, marketplaces were not what HEB is right now in our lives. A marketplace is a gathering place, and so you wouldn't just go to shop, you would go to meet with other people and to talk about things and to hear news from messengers. So if you were a messenger and you wanted to bring a message into a city that you were going to visit, you would go to their marketplace because that's where all the people are kind of assembled and hanging around, and they are ready to hear anything that you bring as news because they didn't have the things that we have for news services. And so the marketplace is where you would go to talk about Jesus to the general public. And that's exactly what Paul is doing here. And he's gone out to the marketplace to talk to all sorts of the common people and tell them about Jesus. So some of the people that he winds up talking to who've been hanging around in the marketplaces are philosophers. And so Acts 17:18 says, also philosophers from the school of Epicurus and others who are called Stoics were debating with him. And some of them were saying, what does this collector of words want? And so they're listening to what Paul is saying, and they're saying, what are you telling us? We don't get this. It doesn't make any sense. We don't know what you're wanting. Why are you telling us this stuff? And so we're going to understand a couple things here about who these philosophers are, because they're going to have take an action that's going to cause this sermon to be given. And so Athens was a center of really it was sort of the cultural center of the world, even the Roman world at that time. And so if you wanted to see culture and things like that, you would go to Athens. And if you wanted to learn new things, that's what you would do, is you'd go to Athens. And so Athens was the center of these two schools of philosophy. So they started in Athens and then spread out from there. And one of them is called Zeno's School of the Stoic Philosophy. And that started up in the late 300s BC, so well before Jesus' time. And another one was called the Epicurean School of Philosophy, and that is in the early 300s BC when that came into existence. And these were schools of philosophy that were started by men. And they came to represent completely different philosophies, diametrically opposed, we would say. And so the Stoics were people who attempted to live by reason and by will, shunning emotion and pleasure. So they thought that the way to live a perfect life was to attempt to live by reason and will. So you would think out what was the right thing to do in every situation, and you would do the right thing, and you wouldn't be guided by emotions or search for pleasure. None of those sorts of things would guide you. It would always be by reason and by will. So if you want a character that you might think of for that, you would think of Spock. Somebody like him would be a person who lives by reason and will and shuns emotion and pleasure. So that's how they thought was the right way to live life. Now the Epicurean school, where the Epicureans indulged all emotion and pleasure, that's what they searched for, and so they made all pleasures and emotions the object of their life, and so they felt that the right way to live was to chase after emotions and chase after pleasures, and that's the right way to live life. And so these, as you can see, are completely opposite philosophies about how you should live your life. And so some of these people have come to Paul as he's speaking in the marketplace, and they're saying, what are you telling us? You're telling us about stuff that doesn't make any sense, and it wouldn't fit into any of their ways of reasoning or thinking. And so they're kind of confused by why he's there and why he's telling them. And here's the important part. And others were saying, he is proclaiming foreign gods because he was proclaiming Yeshua and his resurrection to them. So Paul is actually taking a risk here, and that isn't clear to most people who are reading Acts. If he is found to be supporting a foreign religion, he could be executed as an atheist for doing that, because in the Roman world, there were certain religions that were allowed, and generally, if you had been conquered by the Romans, your religion was allowed to continue. But any outside religions were not allowed, and they were foreign religions. And if you started trying to bring those into the Roman world, you would be punished for that if you were caught doing that. And so Paul has been taking a risk talking about this. So they're saying, okay, I think that he's talking about some foreign gods that aren't part of our God system, and they aren't any other religion that's valid. And so we think that there's a problem here. So some people are actually saying, what you're talking about sounds like it's something not legal. So, and some context for this is that at first, Christianity was seen to be another branch of Judaism. Okay, so there were many branches of Judaism at that time, and Christianity was seen to be just another branch among all the other branches of Judaism. But the Jews really fought against that idea, and they made it clear that they didn't consider Christianity to be part of Judaism. And so ultimately, Christianity was declared to be a foreign religion, and you could be executed as an atheist for being a Christian. And that might seem very strange to us because we don't think of ourselves as atheists. But in the Roman world, we would have been considered atheists because we weren't part of any accepted religion in the Roman world. So, so that's the situation here, is that these people are now saying, this guy seems to be talking about foreign gods that he shouldn't be talking about. And so the consequence is they took him and brought him to the place of judgment, which is called Arios-Pagos, and that's where the title of this message comes from. And Arios-Pagos was a place of judgment. And while they were saying to him, "Can we know what this new teaching is that you proclaim? For you have sown strange words in our hearing, and we wish to know what these things are." But all the Athenians and those foreigners who come to Athens are concerned about nothing except to tell and to hear something new. So the thing about Athenian culture at that time was that they just loved to hear new things and to talk about things and to tell people new things. And that kind of made up their lives, is all of these new things and hearing new ideas and discussing them extensively. That was how they lived their lives, and that was important to them. And nonetheless, they're taking him to this place of judgment so that others can hear this and determine if what he is teaching is a foreign religion that isn't allowed. So Arios-Pagos, as I mentioned earlier, is a stone hill. At first, long before Paul's time, it became a meeting place for a court that was named after the hill. So the hill was called Arios-Pagos, and the court that met there was also called Arios-Pagos. So they would meet there, and as far as we can tell, they didn't have any coverage. They would just kind of go up to the top of the hill and they would discuss legal matters and things like that, and decide what is to be done about those things. So it was a legal court in every sense at that time. But by Paul's time, things had changed, and the court, most people believe, was meeting in a building someplace else, not actually on the mountain called Arios-Pagos, but instead it was the court of Arios-Pagos that was meeting in some building someplace else. So that's kind of a small thing to mention, but that's why he's being taken here, is that these people are concerned that he's teaching things that he's not allowed to teach. And they're going to have judges there who are going to judge and see if that's an accepted religion. So Paul begins his sermon now. He's been taken up to the court of Arios-Pagos, and it says, "When Paulus arose in Arios-Pagos, he said, 'Men, Athenians, I see that in all things you excel in the worship of demons.'" Now, I'm going to break off here and explain demons. In Greek mythology, demons aren't what we think of demons. Demons were just lesser gods. They weren't evil spirits like we think of demons. And so the Greek word daemon is talking about a lesser god, not an evil spirit. So what Paul is saying is, you excel in the worship of lesser gods. For as I was going around and beholding your temples, I found one altar on which it was written, "The unknown God." Him, therefore, whom you do not know and yet worship, I proclaim to you. So that's what Paul is saying. This is what I'm doing. You have this unknown God, and I am proclaiming that unknown God to you. I'm telling you about him. And so Paul has connected himself in to safety. We'll talk about that some more by doing this. So verse 24 continues. "For the God who made the world and everything whatsoever is in it, and is the Lord of the heavens and of the earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands." And we'll see later on why he talks about not dwelling in temples. And it says, "And he is not served by the hands of men, and he has no need of anything, because he gives every person life and a soul." So he's saying this great God that you do not know doesn't need a temple and isn't served by the hands of men. He has no need of anything that men could ever give him, because he gave life to mankind, and he created them. They didn't create him. So Paul makes a number of important points here. We're going to dig into this. So he actually is proclaiming a radical change to Greek mythology here, and we know that as Christianity. But he's using their kind of terms and their way of thinking so that he doesn't get in trouble with the law. And so he does this using their own mythology. He says, you have this unknown God who doesn't have a temple, and because you have this unknown God, Paul says, I know who this unknown God is, and he's the one I'm going to tell you about. And so this makes him secure from the atheism charges that the judges could catch him on if he starts talking about an illegal religion. And so it's kind of an interesting technique that keeps him safe. he doesn't criticize or ridicule their thinking. He doesn't say you have foolish gods, you're wasting your time, you're stupid for doing that. He doesn't say anything like that. He just ignores that. He doesn't even mention any of their gods. But he does override the whole thing. He really is suggesting a God above all of their gods who isn't like their gods, and that would be a radical change to Greek mythology. In fact, it would not just be a radical change, it would be a replacement of Greek mythology with Christianity. So why does he use demons? We talked about that before. Um, uh, the demons means lesser gods, and instead of the word theos, which means gods. And so there were theos and daemons in the Greek system of pantheon of gods. And so he says, you excel in the worship of demons. Why doesn't he say you excel in the worship of gods? Well, there are two ways that might be he might be going on. One is that he doesn't want to call them gods. He doesn't think of them as gods. He thinks of them as false idols that aren't God at all. And so maybe he just doesn't want to call them gods. But there's another reason I think that is the correct reason. And when he says that you people excel in the worship of demons, he's saying you excel in worshiping lesser gods, and you are excelling at lesser gods, and I'm going to show you about a greater God who is greater than all of your lesser gods. So in that, he has really a hint at where he's going, is that you have been chasing after lesser gods, and I'm going to show you the God who is greater than any of them. So he goes on and he describes a God who made the world and everything whatsoever is in it, and is the Lord of the heavens and of the earth. That's a quote from those verses from his speech. So he says, this God, this great God that he's telling them about, the God they don't know, is the creator of everything. And this is a place where Greek mythology was inconsistent on creation. They didn't understand exactly which God did what to create things. They had different ideas about which God. And right now, in our time, they kind of have a generally accepted idea of what Greek mythology said. But the truth is that there were other people who didn't believe that, who didn't accept that the gods created the earth and the universe, or it was done by a different God. And so that's what Paul is stepping into here, is that there's an inconsistency on how the earth came into existence in Greek mythology, and differences of opinions in the people. So he says, this God that I'm telling you about created everything, the world and everything in it, and he is the Lord of the heavens and the Lord of the earth. So he sets up this God as being far greater than any of theirs, and because they didn't have a view, a consistent view on creation, he's able to get away with this because he's really only introducing a new idea about how creation happened when they already have two or three ideas on it that are still kind of open and undecided. So, and he also continues on there by saying, this God does not dwell in temples made with hands. And he's saying this unknown God of his doesn't have a temple. And the Greeks, despite saying that there was this unknown God, had never created a temple for him, because why would you create a temple for a God you didn't know anything about? And so that's part of what Paul uses here, is he says, your unknown God doesn't have a temple, and that's because he doesn't need a temple. He's not a God who needs anything from men. And so he continues on by saying, the great God is not served by the hands of men, and he has no need of anything. So he doesn't need a temple made by men. He doesn't need anything from men at all. They can offer him nothing, and ultimately we see that the reason they can offer him nothing is that he created them, and they didn't create him. And so he continues that sentence by saying, he, the great God, gives every person life and a soul. So he's really saying, God made all of the people, and so why would the people think that they could ever give him anything? He is their creator, and they have nothing that he didn't create to give to him. So, and so his point there is that he gave life to mankind, and mankind are dependent on him and not the reverse, which had really become to be true in Greek mythology. Greek mythology often had people trying to manage the gods, manipulate the gods into doing things for them. And that's a lot of what they did with their sacrifices. They believed that by giving sacrifices to gods, they were giving the gods something that they needed, and the gods would give them something in return for that. So it was basically an exchange, like a monetary exchange. I will sacrifice an animal if you will give me successful harvest. That kind of idea was always in Greek mythology, is that the gods were there to help you and that you could give them things that would benefit them, and so they would give things to you that would benefit you. Okay, Paul spends a lot of time on creation here. There was a hint of it in the previous version about saying that God created everything in the world and everything in it. It was Lord of the universe. And so now he's actually going to get down into the nitty gritty of more creation stuff. And he really does spend a good bit of the verses here on that topic. And so he says, and from one blood, so he's talking about from one person, he made the whole world of humanity to be dwelling on the whole surface of the earth. And he marked out the times in his decrees and set the coasts of the dwelling places of humanity. Now, don't worry so much if you don't understand all of this. We're going to break all of this down because Paul is saying an awful lot with very few words here. And he says, God has done all of these things. He created the whole world of humanity, and he set up all of these things. And he says, so that mankind would be seeking and inquiring after God, and they may find him by his creation. Interesting thought. And we'll go into that later on. Because also he is not far from every one of us. So this God, this unknown God, is not a distant God like the Greek gods. They believed the Greek gods lived on Mount Olympus, and there was no way that they could go up to Mount Olympus to see the gods. So they were separated from the gods, and the gods were not close to them. But Paul says about this great God that he is not far from every one of us. And continuing on, Paul says, for it is by him that we have life and we move and exist. And so I'll just point out one thing here that's interesting. He says that God not only gave us life, but he gave us the ability to move. And we can hardly imagine having life and not having the ability to move, but that is part of what God gave us. So he gave us life and the ability to move, and we exist. So now he goes in and says, so also some of the wise men among you have said, our lineage is from him. So what he's saying there is that some wise men among Greeks have said that the unknown God, our lineage comes from the unknown God. And so again, he's playing on this theme of the unknown God and what Greek people have said about the unknown God. So verse 29, men, therefore, because our lineage is from God, we ought not to think that gold or silver or stone carved by the skill and knowledge of a man is like the Godhead. So this really takes us back to his earlier point, is that God needs nothing from mankind. You can't create idols. He doesn't want that. He is not served by your hands. You can't give him anything and expect anything. It isn't like that with the great God. So we're going to break all of that down because there's so much in it. First, Paul says about God that from one blood made the whole world of humanity to be dwelling on the whole surface of the earth. Now, what he means by that, as I said before, he created one man from which came all of mankind to multiply on the surface of the earth. And I use that word multiply intentionally because that's biblical. The biblical is go forth and multiply. And so that was the instruction not just to mankind, but to all of the animals. And so that's what Paul is saying. He's almost quoting the Bible here. And he says, God also marked out the times in his decrees. And we see that from Genesis 1:14. It talks about God setting times and dates. The moons and stars were the ways of knowing when these times and dates would come. And he decreed dates for them. We know that that's part of the Old Covenant. There were decreed days for certain things to happen. And so really, what Paul is doing here is he's going through Genesis creation for them, giving them the basics of that. And he says, God also set the coasts of the dwelling places of humanity. Now, this idea of setting the coasts is a bit confusing because the word coasts can have two different meanings. So this, we see it being used in two different ways. Once in Proverbs, where we see it, the word coasts means God set the boundaries between land and sea, okay, so that the sea wouldn't encroach on the land. And he also set boundaries between nations. Same word is used with a different meaning here. And so that comes from Deuteronomy 32:8. And so that same word that is translated as coasts here could mean either boundaries between land and sea or boundaries between nations. But I think that the real intent here is that God did all of those things. Proverbs says one, Deuteronomy says the other. They're both correct. Neither is wrong. And God did all of these things. He set up the boundaries between nations and the boundaries between land and sea. And so, as I said before, this is really a short form of the creation story that Paul is giving them. And he's kind of reshaped it into terms that they can understand a little bit better. And of course, not as many verses and not taking as much time. So what Paul is saying here, and we saw that before, is that we can search for and find God through creation. And we know that Paul does that, and he says pretty much the exact same idea in Romans 1:20. Um, he says that you can find God by looking at creation, and Paul does that in many places. He talks about things that you can look at in nature that help you to understand biblical ideas. And that happens many times. I haven't made up a list here because that'd be a little off topic, but that is something that we see in Paul's teaching. Is quite often he will go to things in nature that happen, and say you can use nature to understand what God does and how God is, because He is the creator of that. Is really what it comes down to. So um, Paul also says in those verses that we saw, the big group of verses, some Greeks had suggested that mankind came from the unknown God. And remember, I said that the Greeks had different ideas about exactly how creation of the universe and mankind and all those sorts of things came about. And so he says that your own wise men have said that mankind came from this unknown God. And so he's really building on this existing thing in Greek mythology, this unknown God. And he says, yes, I'm about to tell you about this great God that you don't know. And so, therefore, he says that we should not think that our hands can create anything that is like him. And so he's really against idolatry here. And he's saying, he doesn't call it idolatry. He doesn't describe it as a bad thing. He describes it as a pointless thing. You can't make God happy by making idols of him. He doesn't want that. You can't give him anything because he is the owner of anything, of everything. And everything that you have is stuff that was given to you by God. So, um, so Paul's real point here, in their words, is that you can't do anything that would make God happy. God doesn't want anything from you. And so he is speaking against idolatry, but he doesn't use idolatry. He doesn't kind of point out that that's a bad thing. He just says it's a pointless thing. God doesn't want anything you can offer. Okay, so Paul finishes up his sermon here with these words. For God has banished the time of deception, and at this time he commands all the children of men, everyone in every place shall return to God, because he has appointed the day in which he is going to judge the whole earth in righteousness by the man whom he has designated, and he has turned everyone to his faith in that he has raised him from among the dead. Yes, that is a long sentence, and Paul does long sentences and even verses that cover longer sentences. So we're going to break that down as well. But just a few points I want to pull out of here before we break it down a little more. Um, God, what he's saying here is that God has put an end to the time when there is no truth and only lies. So God has introduced truth that we can know now in this time, and the deception and lies that is part of Greek mythology is coming to an end. And he says now, in this new time, in this time that comes after the times of deception, everyone must return to God. So God is calling to everyone to return to him. They were originally his. They need to return to him. And so he's saying judgment day is coming. And that he says going to judge the whole earth. And he's really changed his tone here. He's switched from talking about creation, and now he starts talking about judgment day. And he says that God has chosen a man who is going to do the judging. And he's going to judge in righteousness. And he says that this man was raised from the dead to turn everyone to faith in him. Now, this is where Paul is going to get into trouble with his audience. They're not going to be able to accept that. But this is where he goes, and this is how it comes to a close, his sermon does. So some people mock this, but others do believe what he's saying here, and they do accept what he's saying. So the verses continue on, and they say, and when they heard of the resurrection from among the dead, some of them were mocking, and some were saying, we shall hear you another time about this. So Paulus went out from among them, and some of them joined him and believed, but one of them was Dionysius of the judges of Arios-Pagos. So one of the actual judges who was there at Arios-Pagos listening to him believes in what he says and goes to Paul and meets with him and becomes a believer. And another person, a woman whose name was Damaris, and there were others as well, but this woman is worthy of mention for some reason. And so he mentions the judge of the court. Yeah, we can understand why that would be a significant thing, is that the actual person who was judging him to see if what he was teaching was valid in Roman world has gone and believed in what Paul is teaching. And also a woman. Now, why is a woman worthy of mention here, and even why is her name mentioned? Um, I don't really understand exactly why that is, but it was significant that a woman also had decided that what Paul was teaching was good and went and talked to him and believed. So Paul's sermon um, may be a synopsis. It may not be all of the things that he said, and that would be consistent with other places in the Bible where things are shortened down a little bit to fit into the Bible. We don't know that for sure. I, to me, I have trouble believing that these people would just accept those few verses. There's like, what, 12 verses of his sermon. And so was that really enough that these people could believe? Well, maybe it was. Maybe there was more words involved. I don't know. But he does interesting and important things. And when I say he, of course, this is the Holy Spirit working through him. He establishes a Greek foundation for his listeners. So he says, you yourselves have this unknown God. And some of you say that this unknown God is the creator of everything. And others of you, well, none of you have ever created a temple for this unknown God, despite that. And so he uses these Greek ideas as the foundation for what he's going to build on. And what he builds is really a replacement for the entire Greek mythology. So, and as we said before, this is necessary for him to do this to avoid being thrown in jail for presenting an invalid religion. So what he does in his message, having put in this foundation that the Greeks can understand, is he presents a God who is much greater than their gods. And he says, this God doesn't need anything from you. There's nothing you could give him, and he needs nothing from you. And so this is, as I said before, very different about Greek mythology. This would be a different kind of God than them. And he says, this God, in fact, gives life. He created these people. And so you are his property, and everything that exists is his property. And so, again, that's a very different idea than Greek mythology. And as we saw, he spends a lot of time on creation. And so you have to wonder, why was that so important that he should spend so much time on creation? There are so many other biblical ideas of Christianity that he could have gone to and expanded on, but he spent a lot of time on creation. And I can't say I understand exactly why he went that way, but it's very interesting that he does. And perhaps part of that was the idea that some Greeks did think that this unknown God was the creator of everything. And so he says, yes, that's true, and here's how he created everything. And remember that also those verses on creation do lead into the idea that because God created everything, he needs nothing from mankind. So then after doing the creation section, which is the biggest section of his sermon, he closes with a point on returning to God to avoid judgment. And so he does get down to what you might call a fire and brimstone message, a message of coming judgment and how to avoid that. And in that part of the message, which is a very short part, he says, a man has been chosen to be a righteous judge over the whole world, and he will be righteous in his judgment, but he will judge the whole world. And the other words that he used there come down to the idea of have faith in him who was raised from the dead. And that's where he got into problem with the people, the idea of a person being raised from the dead. And because of that, his sermon came to an end because a lot of people started saying, oh, that's crazy talk. We're not going to hear that nonsense. And so a lot of people walked off because of what he said there, and his sermon ended. But a lot of people did believe because of what he had said. So this was the right message for the group. We know that because the Holy Spirit would have been speaking through Paul, giving him this message to give to them. And even though only a few people were converted by this message, this is what God was up to, and this is the message he wanted to deliver. And the people that God wanted to reach were reached through it. So it was a successful message. And so we mustn't always think that a successful message doesn't always means that somehow everybody is converted. these things take time. So, concluding this lesson, we must do the same thing when we speak to unbelievers about Jesus. It needs to be the right message or messages at the right time or times. And sometimes the message you give to a person comes in pieces. You talk about something at one time, a different thing at another time, and another time something else. And so we need to do this. And to do this, we must be relying on the Holy Spirit. We cannot ourselves know the best way to present the message. So the Holy Spirit had shown Paul this unknown God and given him this idea of how to bring this message in there and given him the words for the message. So that's what Paul gave them and based it on this unknown God idea. And so for us in our lives, we need to rely on the Holy Spirit to guide us. And to that, we need to be listening for the Holy Spirit. And that's not an easy thing for us, but it's important to doing this. And so when we're in this situation where we're able to speak to an unbeliever about Jesus, we need to speak what we have to say and accept that in faith, God will achieve his goals through the message. We don't know what God's goals are, and we just give the message that we have, and we know that God's achieving his goals. He achieved his goals with the Arios-Pagos sermon, and some believed, and whatever God's goals are, he will achieve through you when you speak to unbelievers about Jesus. And remember, and this is really important, eventually most of Greece becomes Christian, and becomes a very Christian place. All of the old gods are wiped out. That religion disappears. Nobody believes in Apollo or Zeus or anybody anymore, and nobody worships them. And so Greece changed to become Christian, and in the process wiped out all of those gods that they had before. And so what you now see in Greece is at this Arios-Pagos hill, there's a sign there that records the Bible version of those verses. Paul's sermon is on a sign at the Arios-Pagos hill. And so people who go there can go there and read the words that Paul gave on that thing. Now, the Arios-Pagos hill was, as I said, a meeting place for judgment for hundreds of years, but the sign that is there by the Arios-Pagos hill, it contains Paul's sermon as being the most important thing that happened on that hill. So, and another thing about that hill is there's a road near to it that's named after that judge who converted. And so that his name is right there, and recollecting again what the Bible says happened there. And so talking more about the big impact that this had on Greeks, ultimately, not immediately here, only a few people converted with Paul's sermon, but ultimately all of Greece pretty much became Christian. I knew a person whose last name was Apostolopoulos, which is the Greek form of Apostle Paul. And so some people actually took that as their family name, their last name, and have passed it down through the generations to us. And so while Paul's sermon might not have seemed to have been reaching only a few people, it ultimately became a Christian nation. And we need to remember that God achieves his goals and isn't thwarted by anything.